This book has been downloaded millions of times, summarized by hundreds of channels, turned into TikTok clips, LinkedIn posts, morning routine content, and almost everyone who consumes it walks away thinking the exact same thing. Now I know how to win. But here is the thing Robert Greene actually said in an interview that nobody clips. He said he wrote this book partly as a warning, not a manual, a warning. He studied people who mastered every single one of these strategies, and what he kept finding, underneath the victories, underneath the influence and the leverage and the well-placed moves, was a specific kind of loneliness that does not really have a clean name. The loneliness of someone who got so good at reading people that they forgot how to just be with them. That is the book nobody has summarized yet. That is the one we are doing today. We are going way past the social media highlight reels. We are bringing in critical perspectives from military theorists, historians, and Greene's own retrospective insights, and we are going deep into something most breakdowns never touch: the profound psychological cost of leading your life as a constant military campaign. Because most people who pick up this book do the exact same thing. They flip to the table of contents, they see 33 strategies, and they treat it like a takeout menu. Pick the ones that sound cool, memorize them, and move on. And that is exactly why most people who read this book do not actually change how they operate in any meaningful way. When you divorce a strategy from its underlying philosophy, all you are left with is a series of disconnected tactics. And disconnected tactics without philosophy are actually dangerous because they give you just enough confidence to apply force in exactly the wrong situation. What most people miss entirely is the foundation. The two completely contradictory philosophies that Greene built this entire book on top of, which are quietly at war with each other on almost every page. Let's start with the first one, Sun Tzu. Most people have heard the name. Many people have the book sitting on their shelf looking impressive. But let's skip the basic biography. What we actually need to understand is the context Sun Tzu was writing in, because that context changes everything about how you read him. To understand Sun Tzu, you have to look at the economic reality of his era. He was writing during what historians call the Warring States period, roughly 500 years before the birth of Christ. And the name itself tells you everything you need to know. Constant, unyielding war. Rival kingdoms caught in an endless cycle of conflict that drained armies, economies, and entire populations for generations. Raising an army in antiquity was not just a matter of recruiting soldiers. You were pulling farmers out of the fields. And if those farmers are fighting, they are not planting crops. And if they are not planting crops, your kingdom starves the following winter. So Sun Tzu was not writing abstract philosophy for scholars in a tower somewhere. He was writing brutal survival math for rulers who were watching their entire civilization's wealth and manpower just evaporate season by season. That changes how you read him entirely. Most people approach the art of war as a mystical philosophical work, but fundamentally it is an economic argument. His central idea, the one everything else flows from, is deceptively simple. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not minimize the fighting, not fight more efficiently, subdue the enemy without fighting at all. And that sounds like a spiritual principle until you run the survival math underneath it. The practical logic is ruthless. If you fight every battle directly, you bleed your army. You spend everything you have, exhaust your supply lines, and your kingdom starves. Even if you win every single engagement, you arrive at the end of the campaign weakened. And in a world of constant competing rivals, a weakened winner is just the next target. Think of it this way. Winning a street fight by breaking both your hands might make you the winner today, but you are completely defenseless against the next person who steps up tomorrow. So Sun Tzu's strategies are almost entirely built around indirection and deception, making your enemy think you are somewhere you are not, forcing them to commit to a position before you have revealed yours, making the war feel unwinnable in their minds before the first physical blow is ever struck. The goal is to collapse the enemy's will, while leaving their infrastructure and capacity intact for you to absorb afterward. Now hold that philosophy in your head, because here comes the contradiction. The second man Greene builds this book on is Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general and military theorist who wrote his masterwork on war in the early 19th century, and he wrote it right after watching Napoleon Bonaparte completely rewrite the rules of European warfare, Clausewitz had a front row seat to a massive shift in how war was understood. He saw what happened when one man stopped playing by the cautious, defensive, gentlemanly rules of 18th century warfare and simply committed everything at once. Total force, total speed, total psychological dominance. Napoleon did not maneuver around his enemies for months trying to trick them into surrendering. He found their center of gravity and drove his entire army into it, as hard and as fast as humanly possible. Most people assume Napoleon's genius was purely geographic, moving troops better than anyone else. But what Clausewitz understood was that Napoleon's real innovation was psychological. He brought a level of brutal, overwhelming speed that other generals simply could not process in real time. That speed and force shattered every existing model of warfare, and watching all of that, Clausewitz concluded something almost perfectly opposite to Sun Tzu. He concluded that war is not a puzzle to be solved through patience, indirection, and bloodless deception. War is a violent collision of wills, and the only way to truly win a collision of wills is to break the other side's will completely. Not trick it, not outmaneuver it, break it. His most famous line is this: war is merely the continuation of politics by other means. What that means, stripped of its diplomatic phrasing, is brutal and clear. When negotiation fails, when diplomacy fails, when all the clever, indirect approaches have been exhausted, there is a moment where you have to be willing to apply direct, overwhelming force, and pretending otherwise, dressing up that reality in euphemism and clever maneuvering, is to Clausewitz a form of dangerous self-deception that will get you destroyed by someone who is willing to be honest about what conflict actually requires. Now, here is where Greene does something that almost nobody who summarizes this book has ever pointed out. He does not pick a side. He takes Sun Tzu's philosophy of indirection, patience, and bloodless victory, and puts it right next to Clausewitz's philosophy of direct force, broken will, and brutal realism. And he builds 33 strategies out of both of them, sometimes contradicting himself from one chapter to the next, without ever explicitly telling you which philosophy applies to your specific situation. And that matters enormously, because these two philosophies do not just differ in tactics, they stem from completely different assumptions about human nature. Sun Tzu operates on the assumption that if you are smart enough, patient enough, and indirect enough, you can avoid the worst of conflict entirely. Clausewitz operates on the assumption that extreme conflict is inevitable, that the center of human social life is a collision of competing wills, and your only real choice is whether you are prepared to break the other side when that collision arrives. Here is the trap most readers fall into without ever realizing it. If you read this book and unconsciously adopt the Clausewitz frame, you will start treating every minor disagreement in your life as a total war. You will apply overwhelming force where subtlety would have served you far better. You will win battles you never needed to fight, and you will quietly alienate everyone around you in the process. Conversely, if you adopt the Sun Tzu frame without understanding its limits, you will keep playing the long indirect game in situations that have already escalated well past the point where patience is a viable strategy. You will outmaneuver yourself right into a corner while someone taking direct action simply overtakes all your careful preparation. So Greene is essentially asking the reader to develop a meta skill, the wisdom to know which philosophy applies in which situation at which specific moment. But he barely tells you how to develop that meta skill. He hands you the loaded weapons and trusts you to figure out the safety mechanism yourself. Which is why we need to talk about a third figure, one who acts as a bridge between these two extremes, but gets skipped in almost every popular breakdown of this book. B.H. Liddell Hart, a British military theorist writing in the 1920s and 30s, he coined a concept that Greene leans on heavily throughout the book. He called it the indirect approach. Now, what makes the indirect approach different from simply Sun Tzu's deception is this. Liddell Hart studied every major military campaign in recorded history and found a recurring pattern underneath the decisive, lasting victories. What they did instead was find the dislocation point. The dislocation point is the specific place where applying pressure forces the enemy to move, to commit their forces, to make critical decisions under extreme time pressure. and ultimately to expose themselves. The physical attack itself is almost secondary. The primary goal is to dislocate the enemy psychologically and physically before the main blow is ever struck. You make them so off balance that when you finally do apply force, they collapse under their own weight. Think of it like a judo throw. Now, this brings us to something that will genuinely change how you read almost every strategy or business book you pick up for the rest of your life. Examples are curated, carefully, deliberately, almost architecturally curated to support his arguments. It is a masterclass in what researchers and historians call survivorship bias. The 33 strategies in this book all appear to work flawlessly, every single one of them. Why? Because every single case study Greene selects ends in a victory for the strategist. Margaret Thatcher, Mao Zedong, Hannibal. The narratives are sculpted to show the strategy succeeding, but that is not how history actually operates. History is not a sterile laboratory where a formula always produces the same result. Think about what Greene is doing structurally. He wants to show you that strategy number 7, turning chaos into advantage, actually functions in the real world. So he finds a historical figure who used something resembling that strategy and won. And as a reader, you absorb that and walk away thinking, this is a guaranteed formula. Critics of this book, particularly military theorists and historians, have zeroed in on exactly this flaw. The researcher John Adair specifically noted that Greene operates on a deeply problematic assumption that the art of military strategy and the art of daily living map perfectly onto each other. And they do not. The psychology might overlap in places, but the ultimate objectives and environments are entirely different. In war, the objective is usually singular, absolute, and final. Defeat the enemy. In life, in business, in relationships, objectives are multifaceted, ongoing, and heavily dependent on long-term cooperation and trust. Total war does not allow for a functioning society afterward. If you run your career or your relationships like a total war campaign, you might defeat your competition, but you will likely also destroy your reputation, your professional relationships, and the trust of everyone working alongside you. And here is the question that never appears anywhere in this book. How many people tried these exact same strategies in roughly the same situations and completely destroyed their lives doing it? How many people attempted to turn chaos into advantage and got themselves fired for creating a toxic environment? How many political operators tried to indirectly outmaneuver a rival and ended up outmaneuvering themselves into irrelevance? We do not know, because there are no chapters dedicated to the silent majority of people throughout history who tried these approaches and quietly failed. And that absence, that carefully constructed silence around failure, is one of the most important things to understand before we go any further into this video. Because the irony goes even deeper when you look closely at the figures Greene actually champions. Even the winners he celebrates ultimately lost. Take Napoleon again. His reliance on overwhelming speed led him to push so far into Russia that his entire logistical system collapsed behind him. Hannibal is another perfect example. Greene holds him up as a model of unpredictable tactical maneuvering, and crossing the Alps with war elephants is arguably the most audacious, unpredictable military move in recorded history. He won battle after battle on Italian soil, and he still lost the war. He lost because he had tactical brilliance without grand strategy. Rome, on the other hand, had something far more durable than any single general. They had a sociological strategy, effectively endless manpower reserves, deeply loyal allied cities across Italy, and a political system deliberately designed to absorb massive military losses without ever capitulating. Hannibal won every battle and died in exile. Then there is Lyndon Johnson. Greene uses him to illustrate what he calls the political inner front strategy. And looking purely at the mechanics here, LBJ was a genuinely extraordinary reader of people, but we have to look at the full arc of the story, not just the highlight reel. What was the ultimate result of a lifelong campaign built on psychological leverage and manipulation? He ended his career widely despised, deeply isolated, and trapped in a catastrophic war in Vietnam, from which he had no viable exit strategy. His extraordinary ability to read and maneuver individuals in one-on-one situations did not translate into the grand strategic vision required to navigate a geopolitical crisis of that scale. Now, in fairness, Greene does use the Napoleon and Russia story briefly as a caution against overextension, but the imbalance is worth examining closely. You have 10 chapters glorifying bold, decisive, aggressive action, and maybe one cautionary paragraph buried somewhere in the middle about the time that same boldness destroyed an entire empire. That ratio shapes what the reader actually absorbs and walks away believing. Without a serious accounting of the failures, the reader convinces themselves that this toolkit is essentially magic, that if they just apply the right strategy at the right moment, the outcome is guaranteed. And that is one of the most dangerous things about this book in the wrong hands. We have to stop reading it as a guarantee of success and start reading it as a highly volatile, highly sophisticated toolkit. Because like any volatile tool, if used indiscriminately in the wrong context by someone who has not done the deeper work, it produces severe and lasting consequences. Which brings us to what is really the emotional spine of this entire deep dive. What does it actually cost a person to live by these 33 strategies? Not once, not in a single high-stakes salary negotiation or a difficult business pivot. We are talking about an ongoing, daily, relentless posture. What does your psychology actually look like after 10 years of treating every single interaction as a potential military campaign? The cognitive and emotional exhaustion required to maintain that posture is staggering. Greene's framework essentially trains you to run every interaction through a continuous analysis. Who holds the leverage in this room? What does this person actually want beneath what they are saying? What is their hidden agenda? Where is their ego most exposed? Think of it this way. It is like running every relationship through an imaging machine around the clock. Sure, the machine is powerful. You can see the internal fractures, the hidden anxieties, the structural weaknesses in a person's psychology, but you cannot actually connect with someone while you are scanning them. The diagnostic tool itself creates the isolation. And the insidious part is that in the beginning, this kind of analytical detachment feels genuinely rewarding. It feels like a superpower. Most people move through their social and professional lives operating on a baseline assumption of good faith, assuming that people generally mean what they say and want what they appear to want. Developing the ability to look underneath that, to notice the gap between a person's stated motivation and their actual hidden motivation, is a legitimately valuable skill in certain environments. You stop getting taken advantage of. You see the dynamics in a room before anyone else does. You start feeling like you are playing a different game entirely. But here is what that skill quietly does over time. If you spend years practicing what Greene describes, mapping the fears and weaknesses and hidden agendas of everyone around you, you eventually lose the ability to turn that lens off, and intimacy requires you to turn it off completely. Genuine closeness requires the suspension of strategy. It requires taking off the armor, setting down the tools of leverage and analysis, and trusting that the other person will not exploit your exposed vulnerabilities. But if you have spent your entire adult life training yourself to instinctively identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of others, your entire worldview becomes irreparably paranoid. You project your own strategic ruthlessness onto everyone around you. You assume they are running the same calculations you are, and because of that assumption, you can never fully rest. You can never fully trust. You can never fully just be somewhere with someone without part of your mind staying on watch. That is the specific loneliness Greene kept finding in the master strategists he studied. Not dramatic loneliness, quiet loneliness, the loneliness of someone who became so skilled at reading people that they lost the ability to simply be with them. Now, with all of that context in place, the architectural flaws of the book, and the psychological toll it quietly demands, we need to look at the actual strategies themselves, because the popular internet summaries do not just simplify them, they fundamentally misinterpret what Greene is actually teaching, and those misinterpretations are where most of the real damage gets done. Let's take strategy 1. Know your enemy. The common interpretation of this one is so surface level, it is almost useless in practice. People hear it and think it means conducting standard competitive research. Search your rival online. Study their product line. Know their price point. Walk into a negotiation with a folder of data on their last few quarters of performance. That is basic competence. That is not what Greene is describing at all. What Greene is actually pointing at is something far more invasive and far more psychologically demanding. He is not talking about understanding a position. He is talking about deep psychological modeling of a person. The historical figures Greene uses to illustrate this strategy, politicians and statesmen like Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, and Cardinal Richelieu in 17th century France, they did not simply gather data, they mapped the internal psychological architecture of their rivals, the specific fear hiding underneath the stated objective, the patterns formed in childhood or early career that shaped how a rival defaulted under pressure, the specific kind of public humiliation that would be most intolerable to that particular person. Take Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to King Louis XIII of France. Richelieu understood something about the king that most of the court either missed or ignored. Louis XIII had a deep, fragile, almost desperate need to feel autonomous and decisive, shaped in large part by an overbearing mother and years of feeling overshadowed. Richelieu, who was the genuine strategic intelligence running the country, could not simply walk into the king's chambers and tell him what needed to be done. That would have triggered the king's insecurity immediately and produced resistance, so instead, Richelieu would plant the seed of an idea during a seemingly casual conversation. He would present a problem, frame the parameters of the discussion with careful precision, and then let the silence hang. He would gently maneuver the shape of the conversation so that the king's own mind would arrive at the solution Richelieu had already decided on and claim it as his own idea. The king gets to feel the power and creativity of the decision. His ego is satisfied completely, and Richelieu gets the exact policy outcome he needed. Every time, without a single confrontation. That requires an extraordinary suppression of personal ego, the willingness to let someone else take public credit for your own thinking, consistently over years, because the strategic outcome matters more than the recognition. We see a structurally similar dynamic with Abraham Lincoln, and what historians call his team of rivals cabinet. Lincoln deliberately appointed men who would run against him for the presidency, men who genuinely believed they were more qualified and more intelligent than he was. William Seward, Salmon Chase, these were not allies he brought inside, they were rivals, but Lincoln had done the psychological modeling. He understood that Chase was driven by an insatiable, self-righteous ambition that made him predictable under pressure. Seward was more pragmatic, more responsive to camaraderie and personal loyalty. Lincoln could predict, with remarkable accuracy, how each of them would react to any given situation, which allowed him to manage their competing egos against each other while quietly maintaining his own authority over all of them. The mechanism underneath all of this is prediction. If you know exactly how someone is going to respond to a specific pressure before you apply it, you are no longer playing the same game they are playing. You are operating from a completely different level, and the outcome stops feeling like a contest. But the cost of that level of psychological modeling is significant. To map someone with that precision requires emotional detachment from them. You are essentially studying them clinically, while they are standing in front of you having what they believe is a normal conversation, and you cannot genuinely connect with someone you are actively dissecting. Now let's move to strategy 2, the effortless superiority effect. This one circulates constantly in business content and self-development spaces because it confirms something people desperately want to believe, that the most powerful person in any room is simply the one who appears the most relaxed, the unbothered executive, the calm negotiator, the leader who never visibly breaks a sweat when everything around them is on fire. But the way most people absorb this strategy is where it becomes genuinely toxic. People hear it and treat it as a performance note. It feeds directly into the fake it until you make it culture. They walk into a high-stakes meeting and try to project an aura of being completely unbothered without having done any of the foundational work that would actually justify feeling that way. The effortless superiority effect is not about performing calm, it is about earning calm. Greene illustrates this through the film director Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock was famous on set for being almost unnervingly unflappable. He did not hover over the camera. He did not yell or pace frantically. He would often simply sit in his director's chair, sometimes looking half asleep, while the crew moved busily around him. To a young director watching him, it would have looked like the ultimate display of natural, effortless authority. But the mechanism behind that calm was obsessive, almost neurotic preparation. What the casual observer never saw was the months Hitchcock spent before any shoot, meticulously storyboarding every single shot in the film, every lighting cue, every camera angle, every actor's mark, every cut. He had mapped the entire film in his head and on paper before a single camera rolled. The creative work was essentially finished before production ever began. So the calm on set was not a performance. It was the natural state of a man who had already solved every problem in advance. There is a documented story that Hitchcock would sometimes pretend to film scenes the studio was demanding, using a camera with no film loaded, simply to avoid a confrontation he knew was pointless. He was so completely prepared and so clear on his own vision that he could afford to be entirely unbothered by external pressure. You cannot manufacture that through attitude alone. When you attempt to fake that quality, when you wear the performance of calm without the preparation underneath it, the mask holds right up until the moment real friction hits. A client reverses a major decision, a supply chain fails, a project you publicly championed falls apart, and the facade collapses immediately because there is no underlying architecture holding it up. That collapse connects directly to what is arguably the most sophisticated and most consistently underestimated strategy in the entire book. Strategy 5. Know when to stop. In a culture that glorifies the grind, that frames relentless pushing as the defining quality of successful people, the idea that stopping is a form of strategic mastery sounds almost offensive, but it is the most difficult idea Greene presents, and the one with the most catastrophic consequences when it is ignored. Clausewitz identified a concept he called the culminating point of victory, the specific moment in any campaign when you have reached your optimal objective and where pushing even slightly further will begin to yield diminishing returns, or, worse, trigger a reversal that undoes everything you built. The reason this is so difficult to execute in practice is that human ego is almost perfectly designed to prevent it. When someone reaches that culminating point, they rarely recognize it as a moment to stop. They are on a winning streak. They feel momentum, the rational thing, the strategic thing. The thing Greene is explicitly recommending feels exactly like quitting. So they rationalize. They tell themselves the next push will yield even greater returns. They allow the sunk cost of everything already invested, the time, the capital, the public commitment, the emotional energy, to override their ability to read the actual situation in front of them clearly. The geopolitical disasters of the 20th century illustrate this with brutal clarity. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam. In both cases, the grand strategy became entirely disconnected from any realistic assessment of the conditions on the ground, because the political and institutional ego of those nations could not absorb stopping without what they had defined as total victory. They were making precisely the same error Napoleon made in Russia, applying a strategy that had worked brilliantly in a completely different context into a new context where the conditions for that strategy to succeed had already ceased to exist. And the accumulated sunk cost of the campaign made it psychologically impossible to see that clearly from the inside. On an individual scale, consider a corporate leader whose original objective was to secure a significant promotion. Through careful positioning and demonstrated performance, they achieve it. The culminating point of victory has been reached, but then the ego takes over. Emboldened by the win, they begin pushing for more, a larger team, a bigger budget, more visible authority, not because the strategy calls for it, but because temporary success has generated a surge of confidence that feels indistinguishable from momentum. In doing so, they alienate the exact same leadership that just rewarded them. They push past the threshold of goodwill that made the first win possible, and they transform a genuine strategic victory into a vulnerability. They become the problem the organization now needs to solve. Knowing when to stop demands something most strategy books will never tell you to develop, because it is not exciting and it does not make for a compelling thumbnail. It demands the emotional maturity to stand in front of the people you work with, the people you report to, or the people who believed in your vision. Look at something you publicly championed and say clearly and without defensiveness, the conditions have changed, we are stopping. That is why most people never truly master this strategy. It is not a lack of intelligence that stops them, it is a lack of courage. It requires being willing to be publicly wrong about something you were previously so certain about. And for most people, admitting they need to pivot feels like a defeat more unbearable than the actual failure itself. They would rather drive the car off the cliff than admit out loud that they missed the exit 20 miles back. Now let's look at two more strategies that almost every popular summary either glosses over completely or gets dangerously wrong. Strategy 3. Turn the tables, create a threatening presence. This is the one that gets turned into the most reductive and frankly the most toxic self-help content imaginable. Be unpredictable, keep people off balance. Never let anyone feel fully comfortable around you. You will see variations of that interpretation packaged across business content, negotiation advice, and leadership coaching constantly, and almost all of it is missing the actual point Greene is making. What Greene is describing is not volatility, it is not being difficult, moody, or randomly hard to read. The quality he is pointing at is something far more specific and far more disciplined. Controlled unpredictability, the ability to be genuinely hard to anticipate, not because you are chaotic internally, but because you are operating from a layer of thinking that is simply not visible to the people around you. There is a critical difference between those two things, and it is worth slowing down on. Someone who is volatile makes the people around them anxious in a way that is exhausting rather than compelling. People do not feel strategically outmatched by someone who is just difficult to be around. They feel drained, and over time, they do not feel controlled or intimidated by that person. They simply find ways to root around them. They minimize contact. They exclude them from decisions. They manage them from a distance. The volatile person mistakes the discomfort they create for strategic power, when really they have just made themselves a problem everyone else is quietly trying to solve. Someone who carries genuine strategic unpredictability produces an entirely different experience. Their actions consistently make sense in retrospect, but remain genuinely difficult to anticipate in advance, not because they are being deliberately erratic, but because the logic driving their decisions is operating from a longer timeline, a wider frame, and a deeper reading of the situation than the people around them can easily access. The historical figure who embodied this most effectively was arguably Dwight Eisenhower, particularly in his role as Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War. Eisenhower was surrounded by generals with far more flamboyant personalities, George Patton, Bernard Montgomery, men who were loud and forceful and very easy to read in terms of what they would push for. Eisenhower was consistently underestimated by all of them. He appeared measured, almost bland, impossible to provoke, but his decisions were almost impossible to predict in advance because they were never driven by ego or personal style. They were driven purely by an assessment of conditions that was always 3 steps ahead of what anyone else was looking at. That is the threatening presence Greene is actually describing, not someone who makes you anxious, someone who makes you realize slightly too late that they were already ahead of you. The misapplication is treating this as a personality type to perform. You cannot decide to be strategically unpredictable. You become it by genuinely thinking at a different level than the people around you. The unpredictability is a side effect of depth, not a technique layered on top of shallowness. Strategy 4. Lose battles but win the war. This one gets flattened constantly into a simple motivational phrase: play the long game, absorb short-term losses for long-term gains. Everyone nods when they hear it, and almost nobody can execute it in the actual moment it is required. Here is the reason. What Greene is describing is not a philosophical attitude toward patience. It is a specific, concrete, deeply uncomfortable action. It means absorbing a real, visible, public loss in front of people whose opinions matter to you, without defending yourself, without correcting the record, without making sure everyone in the room understands that you actually knew what you were doing all along. You have to let the loss sit there, unchallenged, and let people think whatever they are going to think, because the larger strategic position matters more than the immediate need to be seen as correct. Most people cannot do this, not because they lack the intellectual understanding of why it might be useful, but because the ego does not operate on intellectual understanding. The ego operates on immediate social feedback, and the immediate social feedback of absorbing a public loss without defending yourself feels to most nervous systems like a genuine threat, not a strategic choice, a threat. Abraham Lincoln is the right figure to look at here, because his story gives you one of the most documented and concrete long-game executions in political history. Lincoln's early career was a sequence of public failures that would have permanently ended the ambitions of almost anyone else. Failed business ventures, lost legislative races, a failed Senate campaign against Stephen Douglas that received national attention and national mockery. He was consistently underestimated, dismissed, and publicly written off by people who would eventually find themselves serving in his cabinet. And what Lincoln consistently refused to do, across all of those losses, was spend political energy defending his reputation in the moment. He did not write angry letters. He did not demand public corrections. He did not surround himself with people whose job was to manage the narrative of his defeats. He absorbed the losses cleanly, kept his positioning intact, and stayed focused on what the situation would look like 2 years further down the road rather than 2 weeks. The result was that the people who had most publicly dismissed him, William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates, men who genuinely believed they were superior to Lincoln in every relevant way, found themselves one by one working for him, not because Lincoln had defeated them directly, because while they were busy managing their own images and fighting the battles directly in front of them, Lincoln had quietly maneuvered into a position none of them had been watching. That is what losing battles to win the war looks like in practice. Not a passive acceptance of defeat, a disciplined, active choice to defer the ego's need for immediate vindication in favor of a position that will matter far more later. The people who genuinely master this strategy share one quality that Greene describes but rarely emphasizes enough. They have developed a relationship with their own ego that most people never bother to build. They can feel the pull towards self-defense, feel it fully, and consciously choose not to act on it. Not because they do not care about their reputation, but because they care far more about the outcome they are actually building toward. That gap is where the strategy actually lives. Now, if we pull all of these threads together and look at the bigger picture, something important shifts. We have stripped away the romanticized version of the infallible general who wins through sheer strategic genius. We have looked honestly at the profound psychological damage that accumulates from living in a permanent state of vigilance and suspicion. We have unpacked the unglamorous, obsessive private preparation that actually sits underneath what looks like effortless superiority. And we have examined what it truly costs to reach a culminating point of victory and then blow past it because the ego refused to let go. So where does that actually leave you? Practically, true strategic mastery is not about relentless escalation. It is not about winning every engagement. It is not about becoming the most dangerous person in every room. It is about discernment. The real meta skill is the ability to walk into a room and then calmly ask yourself one honest question. Is this even worth it? Because winning always costs something. It costs energy. It costs time. It costs relationships that took years to build. It costs your own peace of mind in ways that do not show up on any balance sheet until much later. Every time you fully engage in a conflict, you are spending something you can never recover. We come back to Sun Tzu one final time. The greatest victory is the battle you never had to fight. Maybe the real strategy is not becoming someone capable of winning every war. Maybe true mastery is becoming wise enough to recognize which wars were never yours to fight in the first place. So the next time you feel that pull to outmaneuver someone, ask yourself honestly, what is winning this actually going to cost the rest of my life? Because that question might be the most powerful thing Robert Greene ever quietly embedded in this book.